June 6, 1944, 4:30 a.m. Normandy coast. A thin mist clung to the steel-gray waters of the English Channel, from the watchtowers of Pointe du Hoc to the dunes near Omaha. German sentries peered into the fog, straining to see through the emptiness. For months, they had waited for this day, convinced that when it came, the Atlantic Wall would hold the Führer himself had promised. No enemy will set foot on Fortress Europe, but in the distance, thunder rolled across the sea, not the sound of a storm, but of engines. Thousands of them. The horizon flickered with light, growing brighter by the second moments later. The night sky ignited. The largest armada in history appeared, ships upon ships, stretching from one edge of the sea to the other. The defenders of Hitler's Europe watched in silence, frozen between disbelief and duty. By dawn, the illusion of invincibility would shatter, and the fate of the war would change forever. By early 1944, the world had reached a breaking point. The Axis powers were still entrenched across Europe, but the tide of war had shifted in the east. The Red Army was clawing its way back through the ruins of Stalingrad and Kursk in the Mediterranean. Allied forces had landed in Sicily and driven Mussolini from power, yet, despite the growing momentum, the heart of Hitler's empire, Western Europe, remained untouched. The Allies knew that to defeat Nazi Germany, they would need to return to the continent, not by air raids or limited incursions, but by a full-scale invasion, a second front that would crush the German war machine from both sides. The challenge was monumental. The English Channel, once seen as Britain's shield, had to become the gateway to liberation. The German High Command had long anticipated such a move. In 1942, Adolf Hitler had ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a massive defensive line stretching nearly 2,400 miles from Norway's frozen fjords to the beaches of southern France, under the supervision of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Thousands of workers and soldiers reinforced cliffs, mined beaches, and erected concrete bunkers. The coastline became a fortress. Rommel, a veteran of North Africa and one of Germany's most respected commanders, understood the scale of the coming storm. He toured every sector of the French coast, inspecting gun emplacements and testing fields of fire. He famously warned Berlin, "The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. For the Allies, as well as for Germany, it will be the longest day." The Germans believed they had prepared for every possibility. Thick steel obstacles, codenamed Czech hedgehogs, lined the beaches. Millions of mines lay buried beneath the sand. Machine gun nests covered every likely landing point, and coastal artillery could rain shells for miles. Hitler's propaganda machine boasted that the Atlantic Wall was impenetrable, but deep within the Allied headquarters in London, a secret plan was taking shape. Operation Overlord planning began in earnest in 1943. Under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a calm, methodical leader with the rare ability to unite Americans, British, and Canadians under one purpose, his deputy, General Bernard Montgomery, was placed in charge of the ground forces, overseeing the strategy for the invasion itself. To the outside world, the Allies appeared uncertain of where they would strike. The Germans expected the invasion at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. Indeed, it made sense. The shortest distance, the best ports, the most direct route to Germany. The Allies used that expectation against them through an elaborate deception plan, Operation Bodyguard. They created an illusion so convincing that even after D-Day began, Hitler refused to believe it was the real invasion. Dummy tanks, fake radio traffic, and an entire phantom army under General George S. Patton were positioned in southeast England, suggesting that Calais was the true target. Meanwhile, the real invasion force gathered quietly along England's southern coast, hidden under camouflage nets and guarded by secrecy. By May 1944, over 3 million Allied personnel were stationed in Britain, soldiers, sailors, airmen, engineers, medics, and logisticians. Every port and harbor was filled with ships. Every airfield roared with aircraft. Supply depots stretched for miles. The numbers were staggering. More than 5,000 vessels, 11,000 aircraft, and 156,000 troops were prepared for the assault still. The challenge was not merely assembling an army, it was delivering it across a dangerous sea, landing it on fortified beaches, and sustaining it against one of the most disciplined military machines in history. One error, one shift in weather, or one successful German counterattack could doom the entire operation. Invasion was scheduled for early June. Every man knew what was at stake: freedom for Europe, or catastrophe on the shores of France as the final days approached. Eisenhower walked among his men in southern England. He spoke quietly, shaking hands, asking simple questions. He knew many of them would not return in his pocket. He carried 2 speeches, one for victory, and one accepting full blame in case of failure. The world was holding its breath. The beaches of Normandy, once quiet stretches of sand and farmland, were about to become the crucible of history. And across the Channel, German commanders stood ready, certain that their Atlantic wall would never fall. By early 1944, the world had reached a breaking point. The Axis powers were still entrenched across Europe, but the tide of war had shifted in the east. The Red Army was clawing its way back through the ruins of Stalingrad and Kursk in the Mediterranean. Allied forces had landed in Sicily and driven Mussolini from power, yet, despite the growing momentum, the heart of Hitler's empire, Western Europe, remained untouched. The Allies knew that to defeat Nazi Germany, they would need to return to the continent, not by air raids or limited incursions, but by a full-scale invasion. A second front that would crush the German war machine from both sides. The challenge was monumental. The English Channel, once seen as Britain's shield, had to become the gateway to liberation. The German High Command had long anticipated such a move. In 1942, Adolf Hitler had ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a massive defensive line stretching nearly 2,400 miles from Norway's frozen fjords to the beaches of southern France under the supervision of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Thousands of workers and soldiers reinforced cliffs, mined beaches, and erected concrete bunkers. The coastline became a fortress. Rommel, a veteran of North Africa and one of Germany's most respected commanders, understood the scale of the coming storm. He toured every sector of the French coast, inspecting gun emplacements and testing fields of fire. He famously warned Berlin, "The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. For the Allies, as well as for Germany, it will be the longest day." The Germans believed they had prepared for every possibility. Thick steel obstacles, codenamed Czech hedgehogs, lined the beaches. Millions of mines lay buried beneath the sand. Machine gun nests covered every likely landing point, and coastal artillery could rain shells for miles. Hitler's propaganda machine boasted that the Atlantic Wall was impenetrable, but deep within the Allied headquarters in London, a secret plan was taking shape. Operation Overlord planning began in earnest in 1943. Under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a calm, methodical leader with the rare ability to unite Americans, British, and Canadians under one purpose, his deputy, General Bernard Montgomery, was placed in charge of the ground forces, overseeing the strategy for the invasion itself. To the outside world, the Allies appeared uncertain of where they would strike. The Germans expected the invasion at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. Indeed, it made sense. The shortest distance, the best ports, the most direct route to Germany. The Allies used that expectation against them through an elaborate deception plan, Operation Bodyguard. They created an illusion so convincing that even after D-Day began, Hitler refused to believe it was the real invasion. Dummy tanks, fake radio traffic, and an entire Phantom Army under General George S. Patton were positioned in southeast England, suggesting that Calais was the true target. Meanwhile, the real invasion force gathered quietly along England's southern coast, hidden under camouflage nets and guarded by secrecy. By May 1944, over 3 million Allied personnel were stationed in Britain: soldiers, sailors, airmen, engineers, medics, and logisticians. Every port and harbor was filled with ships. Every airfield roared with aircraft. Supply depots stretched for miles. The numbers were staggering: more than 5,000 vessels, 11,000 aircraft, and 156,000 troops were prepared for the assault. Still, the challenge was not merely assembling an army, it was delivering it across a dangerous sea, landing it on fortified beaches, and sustaining it against one of the most disciplined military machines in history. One error, one shift in weather, or one successful German counterattack could doom the entire operation. Invasion was scheduled for early June. Every man knew what was at stake: freedom for Europe, or catastrophe on the shores of France. As the final days approached, Eisenhower walked among his men in southern England. He spoke quietly, shaking hands, asking simple questions. He knew many of them would not return in his pocket. He carried 2 speeches, one for victory, and one accepting full blame in case of failure. The world was holding its breath. The beaches of Normandy, once quiet stretches of sand and farmland, were about to become the crucible of history. And across the Channel, German commanders stood ready, certain that their Atlantic wall would never fall. From the German perspective, the morning of June 6, 1944, began not with clarity, but confusion. The Atlantic Wall, the great defensive line stretching from Norway to the Pyrenees, had been advertised as an unbreakable fortress, yet in practice, it was fragmented, incomplete, and stretched too thin to be truly impenetrable. For months, German propaganda had painted a picture of invulnerability. Newsreels boasted of an iron shield facing the Channel, manned by battle-hardened veterans and backed by superior technology. Soldiers stationed along the coast believed the Allied invasion, if it ever came, would be crushed before it reached the sand. Rommel himself had toured the fortifications only weeks before D-Day. He ordered thousands of obstacles, Rommel's asparagus, to be planted in the surf, designed to tear apart landing craft and impale gliders. Mines covered every approach. Machine guns were set to overlap fields of fire. Yet he knew the truth: the wall was incomplete. The Reich's resources were drained, its manpower exhausted. Many of the defenders along Normandy's beaches were not elite troops, but older men, conscripts, and foreign volunteers. The illusion of security was comforting. It allowed officers to believe that any invasion attempt would falter before it began. But when the first Allied shells struck, that illusion shattered instantly. In bunkers overlooking Omaha and Juneau, German gunners found themselves trapped between the sea and the fury of modern warfare. The air shook with concussions as Allied naval guns tore through concrete and sand. The noise was unlike anything they had heard before, a rolling thunder that made communication impossible. Reports from survivors described the terror and disorientation of those first hours. Some men tried to fire their MG-42s through smoke-filled slits, unable to see targets, only sensing movement. Others were buried alive as their bunkers collapsed. For the younger soldiers, many barely out of training, the invasion was their first taste of battle. Panic set in. Radios failed. Field commanders were cut off. One officer later wrote that it felt like the world had ended. The sea was on fire. From their isolated strongpoints, these defenders faced a grim realization: the wall they had trusted was now a tomb. Germany's defensive strategy in the West was shaped by conflict within its own leadership. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander-in-chief West, believed in a flexible defense, holding the panzer divisions back to counterattack once the main invasion force was identified. Erwin Rommel, however, argued that the Allies had to be crushed at the water's edge. before they could gain a foothold. Result was paralysis. The armored divisions, including the powerful 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and Panzerlehr, were kept inland, waiting for Hitler's direct order to move. That order never came in time. When the landings began in Normandy, the German High Command hesitated. Convinced it was a diversion, they believed the true invasion would strike at Calais, closer to Britain and within range of Allied air cover, even as reports poured in of landings on multiple beaches. Rundstedt's staff dismissed them as feints. By the time Hitler finally authorized the panzers to move, the Allied beachheads were already being reinforced. Thousands of tons of equipment, tanks, and men were landing by the hour. The opportunity to throw them back into the sea was gone for the German troops who faced the invasion. One of the most shocking revelations was the sheer scale of Allied technology. The defenders had heard rumors, whispers of new landing craft, specialized tanks, and floating bridges, but seeing them in action defied belief at Gold Beach. British engineers unleashed their Hobart's funnies, bizarre yet brilliant machines designed to breach defenses. Flail tanks cleared mines with whipping chains. Amphibious D.D. Sherman tanks rolled through waves. Seemingly floating on the sea, bulldozer tanks filled craters and pushed through barbed wire at Omaha. American troops stormed through with bulldozers, flamethrowers, and explosive charges, while naval destroyers moved dangerously close to shore to provide point-blank fire support. The defenders, used to rigid defensive tactics, were stunned by the Allies' adaptability. German weaponry was formidable: MG-42s, mortar, and 88mm guns, but it could not match the relentless coordination between land, sea, and air that the Allies had perfected. Perhaps the most decisive imbalance that morning came from the sky. Allied air superiority was total. German aircraft, once the terror of Europe, were almost absent. Every daylight movement by the Wehrmacht risked annihilation in the hours before dawn. Allied bombers had hit key rail lines and bridges, severing the Germans' ability to bring reinforcements quickly. By the time panzers began moving from the interior, they were easy targets for thunderbolts and typhoons, prowling the skies. One German officer recalled, "Every road was death the moment we moved." The aircraft appeared for the defenders on the beaches. This meant isolation. No reinforcements, no air cover, no escape. They were alone, trapped in their bunkers, watching the horizon fill with fire and steel. Each of these angles, human, tactical, technological, and strategic, reveals how Germany's confidence collapsed under the weight of Allied precision and momentum. The myth of the Atlantic Wall had been built on the premise that no force could breach it, but as dawn gave way to the rising tide of men and machines, that belief began to crumble. The next hours would decide whether the German army could rally, or whether the invasion would become unstoppable. For the German soldiers defending Normandy, the psychological impact of D-Day was more devastating than the physical destruction itself. In the space of a few hours, their worldview, one carefully cultivated by years of propaganda, began to unravel. The Atlantic Wall had been portrayed as impregnable, and the Allies as hesitant, soft, and inferior. But as the horizon filled with thousands of ships and aircraft, that illusion dissolved into fear. German soldiers, many of whom had spent years fighting in the East, realized this was not the weak, disorganized enemy they had been told to expect. Reports from German officers described disbelief turning into dread at Omaha. Defenders witnessed waves of American troops advancing relentlessly through withering fire, even when entire units were cut down. Others followed without pause. It was mechanical, unstoppable. One sergeant later confessed that it felt inhuman, as if the sea itself was coming for us. The defenders, buried in smoke and chaos, began to understand that this was not just another battle. It was the beginning of the end. As chaos erupted on the beaches, one of Germany's most capable commanders was nowhere near the front. Erwin Rommel, convinced that bad weather would prevent an invasion, had returned to Germany to visit his wife for her birthday. His absence during the crucial opening hours proved catastrophic without his direct command. Communication between coastal defenses and higher headquarters broke down completely. Local officers sent desperate messages for reinforcements, but the chain of command was frozen, awaiting Hitler's authorization to move the Panzerschwen. Hitler finally awoke around 10 a.m. He refused to believe that Normandy was the true invasion site. His staff had been conditioned to fear his wrath, so no one dared challenge him. Hours slipped by as the Führer insisted the real blow would come at Pas de Calais. By the time he realized the scale of the Normandy assault, it was too late. The Allies had already secured multiple beachheads, and reinforcements were pouring in. The German command system, rigid, centralized, and paranoid, had paralyzed itself. Rommel's later assessment was brutally honest. Our only chance was to defeat them at the water's edge. Once they broke through, the war was lost for many German troops. Their first direct encounter with American soldiers came on D-Day. What they found defied every expectation. German officers had dismissed the Americans as material warriors, dependent on machines, lacking discipline and resolve. But on the beaches of Normandy, that stereotype died. The U.S. Army demonstrated not just overwhelming firepower, but remarkable adaptability under pressure. When the first waves at Omaha Beach were pinned down by gunfire, small groups of soldiers began to take initiative. Engineers cleared mines and wire by hand. Medics treated the wounded under fire. Officers reorganized shattered units on the spot within hours. The Americans were scaling cliffs, flanking bunkers, and turning chaos into momentum. The defenders, who had expected panic and retreat, were confronted with something far worse: determination. German reports described the American attack as methodical, unyielding, and beyond reason. For every position destroyed, another was built. For every obstacle, a new tactic emerged. The invaders' discipline shocked even hardened veterans. It was at that moment many defenders realized the industrial power of the United States was not just in its factories, it was embodied in every soldier landing on that shore. One of the most crippling blows to the German defense was the loss of communication. Allied air and naval bombardments had shredded telephone lines and radio networks within the first hours of battle. Bunker commanders at Pointe du Hoc and Omaha could no longer reach their neighboring units. Entire sectors fought blind, unaware of whether reinforcements were coming, or if anyone else was still alive. Orders arrived late or not at all at Sword Beach. British troops advanced inland almost unopposed in certain sectors because the nearest German reserves had no idea an invasion was in progress. By the time they received word, Allied armor was already rolling through the countryside. What had been designed as a unified coastal defense devolved into a collection of isolated strongpoints, each fighting alone. Some German machine gun teams held out for hours, surrounded and running low on ammunition, refusing to surrender, but without coordination, even the most heroic stands meant little. The Atlantic Wall had depended on communication and rapid response. Both had been annihilated before noon. By midday, on June 6, 1944, the outcome was becoming clear to those still alive in their bunkers. The Allied fleet dominated the horizon. The beaches were choked with men, vehicles, and supplies. German artillery that tried to fire was instantly silenced by naval guns from above. Allied aircraft patrolled the skies unchallenged from the sea. Warships continued to pound inland positions, and from the land, tens of thousands of troops were advancing with unstoppable momentum for the Germans. This was not merely a military defeat, it was an existential shock. The Reich had promised that no enemy would ever set foot on continental Europe again. Now, they were watching the Allies carve their way into the heart of France that day. The myth of invincibility died. The Atlantic Wall had fallen, and with it, the illusion that Germany could still control its destiny. As dusk fell on June 6, The beaches once defended with pride were now littered with wreckage and bodies. Survivors stumbled from their positions, dazed and broken. No longer soldiers of a victorious empire, but witnesses to its unraveling. The storm that had begun that morning had not only broken through Germany's defenses, it had shattered its confidence, its leadership, and its vision of dominance. The stage was now set for the climactic struggle, the desperate counterattacks, the race for Cannes, and the final realization that the war in the West could no longer be won. As dawn broke fully over Normandy, chaos reigned. Smoke blanketed the cliffs, blurring the line between sea and sky. German gunners shouted orders through the roar of artillery, but their radios crackled uselessly. Cut off by relentless bombardment, officers ran from one shattered bunker to another, desperate to restore command. Yet the tide, both literal and symbolic, had turned from the bluffs above Omaha and Juneau. Soldiers of the Wehrmacht could see what their generals could not. The impossible had happened. Allied ships stretched to the horizon, endless and unstoppable. What had begun as a rumor was now a living nightmare, one they could neither repel nor understand. In the midst of this hell, courage still flickered. A young corporal manned his MG-42 until the ammunition ran dry. Another soldier, his leg shattered, dragged himself to reload for a dying comrade. But valor was no match for the storm that had arrived. The Atlantic Wall, their fortress, their pride, was being eaten alive by fire and steel. Every explosion carved a new hole into the illusion of control. For the first time, they realized this was no diversion. This was the beginning of the end. By mid-morning on June 6, 1944, the German command structure in northern France was disintegrating under the weight of chaos. Reports streamed in from every coastal sector, each one contradicting the last. Some claimed the attack was concentrated near Cannes. Others insisted it was Calais. Still, the real invasion yet to come in the bunkers of the 15th Army. Confusion reigned, born of years of overconfidence and one fatal miscalculation, believing the Atlantic Wall could not fall at 7 o'clock hours. The situation at Omaha Beach had become catastrophic. The 352nd Infantry Division, among the few German units stationed directly on the beaches, was being obliterated. Allied destroyers, moving dangerously close to shore, unleashed point-blank naval fire that shredded concrete bunkers and tore through machine gun nests. German gunners were blown from their emplacements as sand and blood mingled in the tide in Berlin. News was scarce. Field Marshal Rundstedt had pleaded for armored reinforcements the moment reports of the landings came in. Yet the panzer divisions, Hitler's prized weapons, lay immobilized by bureaucracy and illusion. The Führer still slept, and none dared wake him. At 10 a.m., the request for counterattack authorization remained unanswered. Time, the one thing the Germans could not afford, slipped away. Meanwhile, in the command post of the 7th Army near Le Mans, telephone operators fought to maintain contact with forward positions, but Allied paratroopers had severed communication. Lines across the Cotentin Peninsula, villages that had once been quiet Norman hamlets, were now filled with the echoes of firefights. German patrols ambushed in orchards and fields by unseen men wearing strange insignias, screaming eagles and red devils. By late morning, General Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 716th Infantry Division, realized his sector had collapsed. His once proud division, already stretched thin across 60 miles of coastline, was no longer a coherent fighting force. Coastal batteries were silenced one by one. At Courseulles-sur-Mer, Canadian troops breached the seawall and pushed inland, capturing entire platoons of stunned defenders who had never seen a tank this close. Panic spread through the ranks. Some German units fought to the death. Others withdrew chaotically inland. Commanders barked orders over radios that no longer functioned. The overlapping fields of fire that Rommel had so carefully planned now worked against them. Allied smoke screens blinded German gunners. while precision bombing from Typhoon and Thunderbolt aircraft made regrouping impossible at 12 o'clock hours. Rommel himself was still en route from his home in Herrlingen, unaware that the decisive battle of his career had already begun without him, days earlier. Convinced the bad weather would prevent any invasion, he had taken leave to celebrate his wife's birthday now. As he sped back toward the front, he saw the sky filled with Allied planes and realized the magnitude of his error by the time he reached his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon. It was too late. The beaches had been lost, reports flooded in. The British had taken Gold and Sword. The Canadians were pushing toward Cannes. The Americans, despite horrendous casualties, had finally secured a foothold on Omaha, the largest invasion force in history. Over 150,000 men was ashore in desperation. Rommel demanded an immediate counterattack, but the armored divisions were still immobilized by conflicting orders. General Feuchtinger's 21st Panzer Division, stationed near Cannes, finally moved, only to be annihilated by naval gunfire and rocket-equipped Typhoons before reaching the coast. What had once been Germany's most feared weapon now burned on the fields of Normandy, its steel carcasses smoldering beneath the French sun inside the Führer's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair. The first coherent reports reached Hitler shortly before 1 p.m. His fury was volcanic. He ordered all reserves to be committed immediately. Too late. The Allied beachheads were already linked in a single morning. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered for the soldiers trapped in Normandy. The realization was crushing. Many still fought bravely, machine guns rattling against an unending tide of men and steel. But others began to surrender, their faces blank, their uniforms soaked in salt and defeat. One corporal later recalled, "It was like fighting the sea itself. Every wave we stopped was followed by another, and another, until the horizon itself was alive with them." By nightfall, the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's fortress Europe, was no more than a graveyard of concrete, metal, and human ambition. The war had turned in a single day. Germany's faith in its coastal defenses had been obliterated, and the men who once believed the beaches impenetrable now retreated inland, step by step, into the shadows of their own ruin. The fall of command was complete, but the true cost of D-Day was only beginning to emerge. By the dawn of June 7, 1944, the beaches of Normandy lay scarred and silent, a new kind of battlefield. Soaked in the remains of ambition, courage, and loss, the tide carried fragments of war ashore, twisted helmets, shattered rifles, and lifeless men from both sides, tangled together in the sand for the Allies. It had been a triumph bought at an unbearable cost. Nearly 10,000 casualties in the first 24 hours, with over 4,000 dead. Omaha alone had consumed entire companies in minutes. Landing craft had become floating coffins, and the sea itself had turned red beneath the rising sun. Yet, despite the carnage, the impossible had been done. The Allied foothold in Europe was secure for the Germans. The cost was different, not only in lives lost, but in illusion destroyed. The Atlantic Wall, once hailed as an impregnable shield, had crumbled in a single day. Years of propaganda, millions of tons of concrete, and countless hours of labor had failed to stop the tide. What remained were ruins, bunkers blasted open like tombs. Their defenders, buried within. General Rommel surveyed the aftermath in grim silence. The beaches he had spent years fortifying were now graveyards. He understood what the High Command in Berlin still refused to admit, that the war for the West was lost. "We cannot drive them back into the sea," he confessed to his staff. "The best we can do is slow them." But slowing them would come at a terrible price, as Allied engineers cleared obstacles and constructed new supply depots on the beaches. German reinforcements moved desperately toward Normandy, the roads of northern France filled with columns of Wehrmacht trucks, panzers, and horse-drawn wagons, all targeted mercilessly by Allied aircraft. every bridge, every convoy, every crossroads was under constant watch. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, was powerless to intervene. Allied air superiority was now absolute. Meanwhile, the French countryside was burning. Entire villages lay in ruins from artillery exchanges. The people of Normandy, caught between armies, endured unimaginable suffering. Many had spent D-Day huddled in cellars as their homes shook under the bombardment. When the guns fell silent, they emerged into a landscape unrecognizable. Churches collapsed, fields cratered, and streets littered with the dead for the German soldiers who survived the first wave. The sense of betrayal ran deep. They had been promised reinforcements, air cover, and coordination that never came. The rigid command system, the same discipline that had fueled Germany's early victories, had now become its greatest weakness. Orders were delayed, misunderstood, or ignored entirely. Young conscripts, many from Eastern Europe, surrendered in droves, exhausted and terrified on the Allied side. Victory offered little comfort. In field hospitals near Bayeux and Arromanches, medics worked through the night, their tents illuminated by dim lanterns and the moans of the wounded. Men who had stormed the beaches now fought quieter battles against blood loss, infection, and pain. One American nurse wrote in her diary, "We won the beach but lost so many I can still hear the waves. They sound like the guns." By June 10th, the beachheads had merged into a single front. Over 300,000 Allied troops were now ashore, supported by thousands of vehicles and tons of supplies. A logistical miracle. The Mulberry harbors allowed entire ships to unload in temporary, artificial ports built from steel and concrete, what Germany had spent years constructing to keep invaders out. The Allies built in days to bring themselves in still. The battle for Normandy was far from over. Behind the beaches lay the bocage, a maze of hedgerows, sunken lanes, and dense countryside, perfect for defense. German units that had survived regrouped here, transforming every field into a fortress. The fighting grew slower, more brutal. More personal grenades and bayonets replaced tanks and bombers. Progress was measured in yards, not miles yet. Even in the midst of this destruction, something had changed forever. The myth of German invincibility was broken. From Berlin to the Eastern Front, soldiers whispered of the invasion that could not be stopped, and while Hitler raged in his headquarters, his generals knew the truth. The Reich had begun to die on the beaches of Normandy. As night fell on June 7th, smoke still drifted across the sea. In that haze, the outlines of the future could already be seen, a Europe slowly being reborn through fire. By mid-July 1944, the once vaunted Atlantic Wall had ceased to exist, not through a single decisive strike, but through relentless erosion. Every bunker lost, every field captured, every coastal strongpoint destroyed tore another hole in Hitler's western fortress. What began as a single breach in Normandy was now spreading like a fracture across the entire Western Front inside German headquarters. The tone had shifted from confidence to despair. Field Marshal Rommel, wounded in an air attack on July 17th, lay hospitalized as the Wehrmacht bled itself dry, trying to contain the Allied advances. Reports before the attack had been blunt and fatalistic. The enemy's air superiority is overwhelming. Our troops are being annihilated from the air. This front cannot hold much longer. Berlin ignored him. The illusion of control mattered more than the truth. The Allies, meanwhile, had turned their foothold into a juggernaut. Operation Cobra, launched in late July, shattered the German lines around St. Louis. American bombers blanketed the region with explosives, turning the hedgerow country into an open plain. Once the armored divisions broke through, the Wehrmacht could no longer contain them. Tanks from the U.S. Third Army under General Patton surged forward, advancing dozens of miles a day. The German army, designed for fast attacks, was now trapped in retreat. The Falaise Pocket became the grave of the Western German army. Between August 12 and 21, 1944. Allied forces encircled nearly 100,000 German troops. The roads out of the pocket were choked with burning vehicles. Dead horses and soldiers desperate to escape Allied aircraft hunted from above. Turning columns of men into charred wreckage, General von Kluge's 7th Army was annihilated. The survivors, staggering eastward, carried with them the grim knowledge that the war was no longer winnable for the German people. D-Day's failure marked the beginning of an irreversible collapse. Propaganda could no longer conceal the truth. Cities lay in ruins under Allied bombing. Food was scarce. Refugees streamed from the west as the Allies advanced, and from the east as the Soviets closed in. The myth of Hitler's unbreakable defense crumbled as fast as his armies and occupied France. The tide of liberation swept rapidly inland. By late August, Paris rose in revolt. The German garrison there, demoralized and cut off, surrendered after a brief fight. French and American troops entered the capital to scenes of euphoria, flowers, flags, tears. For the first time since 1940, the tricolor flew again over the city. The world had turned within the German high command. The blame game began. Some officers, like Rommel and von Stauffenberg, had already recognized the futility of further resistance, their involvement, real or suspected, in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler led to their downfall and deaths. The dictator's paranoia deepened, ensuring that rational military strategy was replaced by blind fanaticism. The psychological blow of D-Day cannot be overstated. It was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a symbolic collapse. The Reich's aura of invincibility, forged in blitzkrieg and cemented through fear, had evaporated. The Allies had done what Hitler promised was impossible. They had landed in Western Europe and stayed. Every German soldier now knew that the war's end was only a matter of time. By September 1944, the Allied forces stood at the borders of Germany itself. What had begun with a single morning's assault on the beaches of Normandy had become the liberation of an entire continent. The Atlantic Wall, the pride of Hitler's military engineering, was nothing but rubble. The concrete that once faced the sea now faced history's judgment. And yet, amid this devastation, the seeds of a new Europe were already being planted. The lessons of Normandy, unity, coordination, sacrifice, would later shape the alliances and institutions that sought to prevent such a war from ever returning. The cooperation between Britain, the United States, and Canada forged on those beaches would evolve into the NATO alliance that would define the Cold War. The men who had survived Normandy carried its memory for the rest of their lives. For the Germans, it was a lesson in humility, that arrogance and ideology could not stand against determination and freedom. For the Allies, it was proof that democracy, when united, could overcome even the darkest tyranny. In the ruins of the Atlantic Wall, one could still read the story written in stone and blood, that no fortress, no matter how strong, can withstand the will of those who fight for liberation. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the beaches of Normandy stood as a solemn monument to both courage and consequence. The tides that had once carried thousands of men to battle now washed gently over fragments of their story. Rusted landing craft, broken helmets, and the faint outlines of trenches reclaimed by sand and time. For the Allies, D-Day became a symbol of what unity could achieve when nations stood together against tyranny. It was not merely a military triumph, but a moral one, proof that freedom, though fragile, could endure the most violent storms. The courage of soldiers from dozens of nations forged a new faith in collective defense, a faith that would later evolve into the Atlantic Alliance and define the modern Western world. For Germany, the memory of Normandy carried a different weight. It was the beginning of reckoning, a slow, painful confrontation with the cost of blind obedience and misplaced faith. Many who had fought on the Atlantic Wall would later admit, in old age, that D-Day shattered more than just defenses. It broke the illusion of destiny. It forced a generation to see the difference between loyalty and truth. The Atlantic Wall, once called the fortress of Europe, now lies in ruins, its bunkers filled with silence, yet those ruins speak. They remind the world that no wall of concrete or ideology can protect a regime built on oppression. In the decades that followed, Normandy became sacred ground. Veterans from both sides returned, enemies once, now old men, standing together in shared remembrance. They spoke not of victory or defeat, but of survival, sacrifice, and the hope that their children would never see what they had seen. Day was more than the day the Allies landed. It was the day Europe began to breathe again. From the ashes of war rose a new order, fragile yet determined, a Europe that chose unity over division, democracy over domination. And as the waves continued to touch the shores of Normandy, they whisper the same truth that history has carried ever since, that freedom, once won through blood and sacrifice, must never again be taken for granted.